Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The farmhouse was cold and dark, and Daniel Marlowe was on his knees on the kitchen floor. Not in prayer, not in defeat. He was on his knees because his German shepherd, Rex, had been pawing at a loose floorboard for the last 10 minutes. That low, quiet whine, those ears pressed all the way forward, that look in the dog's eyes that Dan had learned to trust more than any instrument or map or order he had ever been given in 30 years of service. Something was there. Rex was sure of it. And when Rex was sure of something, Dan had learned a long time ago, you listened. He pressed his fingers around the edges of the board. It shifted. He felt something cold and metal beneath his fingertips, a small iron ring set right into the wood. He looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him, still, certain, the same way he used to look just before they cleared a building together in some dark corner of the world. That look that said, "I already know what's there, you just need to catch up." He pulled the ring. A door lifted from the floor. Cold air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying the smell of stone and earth and something much older than the house itself. Rex moved to the edge without being asked and began going down the narrow wooden steps, one careful paw at a time, his gray muzzle disappearing into the dark first, the same way he had always gone first, in every dangerous place, in every dark room, in every country Dan had ever served in. Dan sat back on his heels and stared into that darkness. He had not expected to feel anything in this farmhouse. He had not expected to feel much of anything anywhere for a long time now. He reached for the flashlight in his jacket pocket and followed his dog down into the dark. It had been 53 days since he buried Emily. He knew that number without counting, the way you know the weight of something you carry every hour of every day, not because you measure it, but because you feel it pressing against you from the inside. 53 days since he stood at a graveside in a small Virginia cemetery in the November rain and watched the only person who had ever truly known him be laid to rest. 53 days since the house they had shared in Stafford stopped being a home and became something else, every room a reminder of someone who was no longer in it. Emily Ann Marlowe had been 53 years old. She and Dan had been married for 27 years. In those 27 years, she had done something that very few people in Dan's life had ever managed to do. She had made him feel safe. Not in the world outside, Dan knew better than most what the world outside could hold, but inside their home, inside the sound of her voice in the kitchen in the morning, inside the warmth of her hand finding his in the dark on the nights when the memories came back and he could not speak. She had brown eyes and a laugh that started quietly and then could not stop itself. She kept her mother's apple pie recipe on a card inside a cookbook on the second shelf, written in her own handwriting. Dan had not been able to open that cookbook since she passed. The sight of her handwriting in that kitchen, in her kitchen, was the kind of thing that took all the air out of a man at once. He still set 2 coffee cups out every morning. He did not realize he was doing it until the 3rd week. He stood at the counter and looked at the second cup and understood, in the full weight of that moment, that the quiet was not going to end. It was not the quiet of someone stepping out for groceries or working in the garden. It was permanent. It had no bottom and no relief. He left the second cup where it was, every morning after that. Moving it felt like agreeing to something he was not ready to agree to. The only soul who did not leave him in those 53 days was Rex. Rex had been Dan's military working dog for 4 years before they both came home for the last time.
In those 4 years, Rex had done things that no official record could fully capture. He had pulled Dan from the rubble of a blast in Afghanistan that should have killed them both. He had stood between Dan and danger more times than either of them could count. He had slept at Dan's feet in foreign darkness on more nights than Dan could remember. When Dan came home, Rex came home with him. That had never been a question. Rex was 9 years old now. His muzzle had gone gray. His hips hurt on cold mornings from an old wound that had never fully healed. But his eyes had not changed. Deep amber, steady, watching Dan with a care so complete and so quiet that it felt less like the gaze of a dog and more like the gaze of someone who understood exactly what Dan was carrying and had simply decided, without being asked, without any condition at all, to stay.
When Dan sat awake at 3 in the morning, Rex lay at his feet. When Dan slept on the couch because the bed felt too large and too quiet, Rex pressed his warm body against the cushions beside him. When Dan stood at the kitchen counter, staring at 2 coffee cups, Rex sat close and leaned, just slightly, just enough into his leg. He never asked for anything in those moments. He only stayed. A letter arrived 6 weeks after the funeral from an attorney in Cedar Valley, North Carolina. Dan's estranged father, Thomas Morlow, had died at 79. They had not spoken in 11 years. That silence between them had deep roots, old pain, old distance, the kind of space that grows between a father and a son when neither one knows how to close it and both are too proud to try. Thomas had left Dan a farmhouse and 12 acres of mountain land in Cedar Valley. That was all. No letter, no explanation, just land and wood and silence, which, Dan thought, was very much like the man. He might have sold it without ever seeing it, but his doctor had told him plainly that staying inside that house in Stafford, inside those 4 walls full of her memory, was not going to help him heal. That grief needs air. It needs a different room. So on a cold Tuesday morning in December, Dan loaded Rex into the truck, laid Emily's folded quilt between them, and drove south toward the mountains. Cedar Valley appeared through the truck window like something from another time, a narrow mountain road curving between bare winter trees, their branches laced with ice catching the pale afternoon light. The valley below was deep and still, the kind of still that the mountains make in winter when the world has agreed, just for a season, to slow all the way down. The farmhouse stood at the end of a dirt road at the top of a hill. It was not grand. The roof sagged a little under the weight of old snow. The windows were dark. The stone chimney was cold. But the walls were solid, built by someone who meant them to last, and the old oak trees around it stood tall and quiet, like they had always been there and always would be. Dan stepped out of the truck into the cold air and stood looking at it. Rex stepped out beside him and paused, reading the tree line, the roof line, the open ground, the way he had once read the rooftops and doorways of dangerous streets in faraway places. Then, satisfied with what he found, the shepherd walked toward the front door at an easy pace, like he had already decided, like he was already home. Inside, the house was the kind of cold that only comes from years of being empty and unloved. A dead fireplace held the gray ash of a fire long burned out. Dust drifted in the thin light from the windows. A clock on the mantel had stopped at 2:17. Dan stood in the middle of the front room and said, quietly, to the dog beside him, "Just a few days, boy, then we're gone." Rex walked to the fireplace and lay down, as if he had already chosen. Dan found dry wood stacked behind the house and built a fire that evening. He sat in the one heavy wooden chair the house had and watched the flames and tried not to think about anything at all. Rex slept by the hearth. At some point, Dan drifted into that thin place between sleep and waking, where the mind lets its guard down just enough to feel what it has been keeping out. He was back in their kitchen in Stafford. Emily was at the stove, her back to him, humming something low and familiar. He could smell coffee. He could see the morning light on the back of her neck. He reached out his hand toward her shoulder. Rex's soft whine cut through the dark. Dan was awake in an instant. The fire had burned low. Rex was standing in the kitchen doorway, his body still, his ears forward, his eyes fixed on the floor near the far wall. Dan watched him for a moment. Then he got up and followed. The cellar beneath that floorboard was small and stone-walled, low to the ceiling, cold and quiet. A rusted cot stood against one wall, an old lantern sat on a wooden shelf, and on a low table in the corner, stacked with great care, as though placed there by someone who very much wanted them to be found one day, were 8 leather journals, their covers cracked with age. Rex walked to the center of the small room and sat down, watching, waiting. Dan picked up the first journal. The handwriting inside was slow and careful, the handwriting of a man who did not write often, but who wrote with full intention when he did. The first entry was dated February of 1987. 2 tonight. One was a soldier, wouldn't speak at first, let him sit by the fire. He ate eventually, left before morning without saying goodbye. I think that means he'll be all right. Dan turned the pages slowly. Entry after entry. A young man from Kentucky who sat on the porch for 2 days without a word and left on the 3rd day looking, as Thomas wrote, like someone who had just remembered he was still alive. A Vietnam veteran who came one January and stayed a week, splitting firewood every morning, never talking about where he had been. A young Gulf War soldier, barely 20 years old, who Thomas described in 4 quiet words that made Dan stop breathing for a moment. Eyes like my son's. His father had known. All those years of silence between them, and his father had known. Dan's hands were shaking now, not from the cold. He turned to the last entry in the last journal, written in a hand that had grown less steady with age, but no less sure. Just 3 lines. Can't keep the fire burning much longer on my own. If you find this, whoever you are, keep it burning, especially for those who served. They come ashamed, they leave warmer. That is enough. That is everything. Dan sat down on the cold stone floor. Rex pressed his warm body against Dan's side and stayed there. And Dan put his arm around his dog and bent his head and wept. Not the short, held-back tears of a man at a funeral trying to hold himself together. Real tears, the kind that have been waiting for weeks behind the walls of a man who has spent his whole life being the one who does not break. He wept for Emily. He wept for his father. He wept for every brother he had lost in the dark. He wept for the years of silence between him and a man who had spent his whole quiet life keeping a fire burning for broken men and never once told his own son. Rex did not move. He stayed warm and solid against Dan's side and did not move at all. 3 nights later, a storm came down hard from the mountain. Wind drove snow against the windows in long waves. The fire Dan had built, a real fire now, one he had learned to keep through that first cold week, threw warm orange light across the walls of a room he had begun, slowly and without planning it, to care about. The knock came just after 9 at night. 3 knocks, slow, like a man who had raised his hand twice and put it back down before finally making himself do it. Rex moved to the door on his own. He sat in front of it, calm, present, ready, not threatening, just there, the way he had always been there. Dan opened the door. The young man on the porch was maybe 30 years old. His jacket was too thin for this weather and torn at the shoulder. His boots were soaked through. His eyes had that hollow, far-away look that Dan did not need anyone to explain to him. He had seen that look in foreign places. He had seen it in mirrors. The young man said, his voice rough and quiet, "Someone in town said maybe you help guys like me." Dan said nothing. Rex stepped forward slowly across the threshold and walked up to the young man the way he had always approached someone who needed gentleness rather than caution, unhurried, soft, completely sure of himself. The young man flinched when the big shepherd moved toward him. Then he went still. Then he went down to one knee in the snow on that porch, and Rex pressed his gray muzzle gently into the center of the young man's chest. And the young man wrapped both arms around the dog and broke. He sobbed into Rex's fur the way a man sobs when he has been holding on for far too long, and something finally, mercifully, tells him it is safe to let go. His whole body shook with it. The snow fell quietly around them both. Dan stood in the doorway and looked away. His jaw was tight, his eyes were burning, because he knew that sound. He had heard it from brothers in the dark overseas. He had heard it from his own chest at 3 a.m. in a chair in Virginia. He stepped to the side and held the door open wide. "Come in," he said quietly. "Fire's still burning." The weeks that followed came the way healing always comes, not all at once, not in any moment you can point to, but slowly, in small things that add up without you noticing, until one day you look back and realize something has shifted. Veterans found their way to the farmhouse the way people find the things they truly need, not through signs or announcements, but through one person quietly telling another that there is a place in the mountains where the fire is on and no one will ask you to explain yourself. Some came for a few hours, some stayed for days, some sat without speaking at all. Some talked through the whole night about things they had never said out loud to another living soul. Dan listened to all of them the way only a man who has been in the same dark places can listen, without trying to fix it, without rushing it, without asking for anything in return. Just present, just there. He fixed the roof. He repaired the stove. He split wood until his back ached and then split more. He kept the fire. But Rex was slowing down. Dan noticed it first in the mornings. Rex would lie still for a long moment after waking, as though gathering himself before he tried to stand. Then the hesitation on the porch steps. Then the afternoon in late January when Rex tried to rise from his place by the fire, and his back legs gave way and he went down onto the floor with a sound so small and so quiet that it hurt more than any loud thing Dan had ever heard. Dan was beside him before the sound had finished. He went to his knees next to Rex and put both hands gently on his dog's side, and Rex looked up at him with those steady amber eyes. Not afraid, not lost, just there, completely and quietly there. And his tail moved once against the floor, one slow, sure thump. Dan's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, the same voice that had once held steady under gunfire. "No," he said, softly, "not you, too." He lifted Rex's head into his lap and sat on the floor of that old farmhouse and held his dog the way you hold the last thing in the world that you cannot bear to lose, with both hands, without holding anything back. "You pulled me out of that blast," he whispered, his forehead slowly dropping toward Rex's. "You stayed when everyone else was gone. You brought me to this place. You showed me what was under that floor." His voice broke on the words and he let it break. "You brought me home, partner, every single time." Rex rested his head on Dan's boot. The fire crackled low and warm. Snow fell outside in the dark, soft and quiet and slow. And Dan pressed his forehead gently against the forehead of his dog and made a promise the way all the best promises are made, in the dark, in the quiet, with no one watching. "I'll keep it burning. I swear to you, I will keep it burning."
By spring, there was a new wooden sign at the gate of the farmhouse in Cedar Valley. Dan had made it himself from a piece of cedar wood, the letters burned carefully into it by hand. It read simply, "For those who served, the fire is still burning."
Along the front porch, he had turned the soil and planted seeds he found tucked inside an old work glove in the cedar chest upstairs. He did not know what kind of flowers they were. He planted them anyway. And when the first small green shoots pushed up through the cold April ground, he stood on the porch steps and looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Rex moved more slowly now. The cold mornings were harder. Dan had added a second blanket to the place by the hearth and had started carrying Rex up the porch steps on the difficult days. Rex accepted this quietly, the way he accepted everything, with calm eyes and steady breath and that unshakable sense of trust that had never once wavered in all their years together. Veterans still came to the farmhouse, quietly, without any noise or announcement, with that look in their eyes that Dan now knew how to meet without looking away. He met it with coffee and fire and the simple, steady presence of a man who does not need you to be anything other than what you are right now. Some of them sat with Rex by the fire and said nothing at all, and Rex leaned into them with his warm gray weight, and something in those men would ease. Some held breath would release. Some long-closed door inside them would open just a little. Dan watched those moments from across the room, and each time he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness yet, not all the way, but something close to it, something that felt like purpose, like a man who has been given something worth doing and has chosen, knowing full well how hard it is, to do it. He thought of Emily every single day. He thought of her in the mornings at the kitchen counter. He thought of her when the evening light came through the west window and turned the wooden floor warm and golden, the color she had always wanted for a kitchen floor and never quite got around to choosing. He thought of her when those first spring flowers opened along the porch, small and quiet and somehow perfectly placed, as though someone who loved this land had known exactly where they should go. He did not think she was gone. He thought she had simply moved to a room he could not enter yet, but he could feel her through the wall, warm, close, still humming something low and familiar. He thought his father was there too, quiet, as always, tending a fire of his own. Daniel Marlowe did not inherit a farmhouse. He inherited a purpose. He learned through loss and cold and the stone floor of a hidden cellar that the bravest thing a man can do is not always what happens on a battlefield. Sometimes the bravest thing is simply to leave the door open, to keep the fire on, to sit with another person in their darkness and not try to fix it or rush it, but simply to stay, warm, present, steady, the way a good dog stays, the way Rex had always stayed. And in keeping that fire burning, in every cup of coffee handed to a hollow-eyed young man at the door, in every night spent listening to a story the world had not been willing to hear, in every cold morning when he rose and built the fire again in that old stone hearth, Daniel Marlowe found, one quiet day at a time, what he had been looking for since November. Not a reason to forget, a reason to stay. If this story touched your heart today, if it reminded you of someone you love, someone you have lost, or someone who stayed beside you when everything went quiet, please take just a moment right now and share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can say to another person is simply, "I thought of you today." And if you have not yet joined our family here at Silent Paws and Brave Hearts, please hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week, we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about the men and women who carry wars that no one else can see.
Stories about the dogs who refuse to leave them. Stories about the quiet, everyday, extraordinary courage it takes to keep the fire burning when the night is long and the house is cold and you are not yet sure the morning is coming. It is coming. It always comes. We will see you next time, friends. Until then, keep the fire burning.